Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. Our subject for today is Thomas Cranmer, but rather than focusing our discussion on his part in shaping the English Reformation and thus the national church, I want to look at why he became a prime focus of, frankly, vengeance for Mary Tudor. Something that she then acted upon when she became Queen Mary I. Now, undeniably, Cranmer leads a varied and interesting life. I mean, there is material enough for me to make a series as opposed to this single video. But for now, I want to look at what led up to his end. To look at his fall and its foundations, if you will. So, we've got a lot to cover. Let's jump in. I do think it's useful for us to start with a look at Thomas Cranmer's origins, in the hopes that we can better piece together just how he came to be in a position where he would incur Mary's ire in the way that he did. Thomas Cranmer's early life is somewhat obscured, but we do have his date of birth, or at least what's given as his date of birth, which is the 2nd of July 1489. The Cranmers came from established gentry stock. They had a right to bear their own achievement of arms. But nevertheless, this branch of the family does not enjoy much more than modest financial means. As Thomas was a younger son, additionally, he was not destined to inherit from his father's estate. Instead, he's going to be expected to build his own career path. And the traditional ways to this were either via the universities, the Inns of Court, or indeed through an apprenticeship. For Thomas, his brother Edmund and their sister Alice, the path would become a religious one. Alice becomes a nun, while Thomas and Edmund prepared themselves for a life in the clergy. Thomas's early education may have taken place at home, but at some point he transfers to a grammar school. In 1503, a 14-year-old Thomas Cranmer was admitted to Jesus College, Cambridge. Damon McCulloch has pointed out that the 8 years it took Thomas to obtain his BA represented, quote, a surprisingly long time, and that he may have been delayed from completing until 1511 because of some financial issues for his family, or alternatively, McCulloch suggests that Thomas's, quote, acknowledged problems in absorbing information quickly, end quote, might be a reason. Now, I must say, when I saw that phrase, his acknowledged problems in absorbing information quickly, my first thought as a dyslexic was, yup, same. And by the way, while this might have resonated with me, this is not me retrospectively diagnosing Thomas Cranmer. But I must say I do remain curious as to just what this particular description may in fact relate to. In any case, he obtained his MA in 1515, which is 4 years after his BA, and thus within the bounds of the expected time frame. Now, that actually might need some clarification. Early modern and medieval education doesn't start or end at particular ages, although there were averages that increasingly became the standard as this period goes on. So the same is true of length of study. This is also variable. Essentially, it takes the length of time needed for an individual to be able to obtain the skills that were deemed necessary by those tasked with guiding their studies for those studies to be completed. In the aftermath of obtaining his MA, Cranmer was also granted possession of a fellowship of Jesus College. This is another success. So perhaps we might say that the issues that had slowed his progress to obtain his BA must have abated, or at least that they had come to lack a similar power in this next phase of his university career. Let's come on to Mary Tudor. Daughter of King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, she is born on the 18th of February 1516, which is the year after Cranmer had obtained his MA. Mary's maternal grandparents were Isabella and Ferdinand, who were known as the Catholic monarchs. They were celebrated for reclaiming Spain in the name of Christendom. 5 years after Mary's birth, on the 11th of October 1521, Pope Leo X would grant Mary's father the title of Defender of the Faith, as a reward for his proven loyalty to the papacy. And thus, little Mary was born into a family where orthodoxy in matters of faith was seen to be paramount. And this was also a family that held the requisite power to ensure that that faith was also truly observed within their nations. At this early stage, the lives of Mary Tudor and Thomas Cranmer had not intersected. And indeed, what Thomas did next might have meant that they never would, or at least not in the way that they did. Because at some point, within 2 years of receiving his MA in 1515, Thomas had decided to marry. His bride was named Joan, and her maiden name may have been Brown or Black. Much else about her is unknown, however. For example, we don't know how the pair met, who her family were, where she came from, or even how old she was. What we do know is that this marriage required a career shift for Thomas, as it meant that he could no longer hold his fellowship that he had obtained after his MA. So instead, he moved sideways and perhaps a little bit downwards to become the common reader at Buckingham College. Buckingham College is now known as Magdalen College, having been refounded as such in 1542. But there is something else that we can't be sure of when it comes to Thomas and Joan, and that is just how long this couple were married before it ended in tragedy. Because very sadly, Joan would die in childbirth, and to compound matters further, the baby that she was carrying also died at this time. Now, I think that it should be taken as a sign of Thomas's academic aptitude that Jesus College decided to allow this now widowed man to return to the fellowship that he had been previously forced to give up. Thomas's academic focus was theological, and in 1520 he was selected by his institution to receive a licence that would allow him to preach throughout the nation. And for this to happen, he must have been ordained prior to this date of 1520. 6 years later, in 1526, Cranmer would obtain his doctorate in divinity. When we consider the role that Cranmer would come to take in shaping the ecclesiastical and indeed political life in the England of Henry VIII and his children, it is, I think, somewhat surprising, shall we say, that at least in the early 1520s, his faith position seems to be one of orthodoxy and conservatism. In 1523, John Fisher's refutation of Martin Luther's assertions would be published in Antwerp, and Thomas Cranmer would add his own marginal annotations into one of the copies. Cranmer complains that, quote, Luther wantonly attacks and raves against the pontiff, meaning the Pope. He accuses a whole council of madness. It is he who is insane. He calls a most holy council impious. Oh, the arrogance of a most wicked man. As far as I'm concerned, this must mean that until 1523 at the very earliest, Cranmer was a loyal devotee of both the idea of papal authority and the perception of the sanctity of holy councils. Now, it is quite hard to pinpoint exactly when his opinion changes, or for that matter, what event or indeed events precipitate that change. What does seem clear is that it does change, and that the position that he ends up occupying will ultimately be the thing that sets him on a collision course with Mary Tudor. But we can potentially trace it back to July of 1529, at a point when King Henry VIII's great matter was endangered by the closure of the papal hearing that was being led by Cardinals Campeggio and Wolsey. The failure of this hearing to find in Henry's favour would, of course, ultimately destroy Wolsey. The rest of the king's advisers, understandably, were desperate to find a way to achieve what their master wanted. Two of these advisers were Stephen Gardiner and Edward Fox, and they were colleagues of Cranmer's from Cambridge, albeit they did come from different colleges. At some point, in the August of 1529, Gardiner, Fox and Cranmer are having dinner together, and they are discussing the impasse that had been reached in regards to Henry's annulment. Now, at this point, Thomas Cranmer suggests that rather than seek to solve the matter through canon law, as they had been doing, it should be, more expediently, explored by university theologians. Now, despite the credit that Cranmer gets, this was not a new idea. I mean, after all, a large part of the university's stock in trade was rhetorical education and debate. Indeed, by many accounts, the question of the legitimacy of Henry and Catherine's marriage had already been discussed and indeed voted upon by many university theologians. However, it does seem that when Henry was informed of Cranmer's suggestion, it provided the required reminder to create an impetus for a sharp shift, which changed the focus and ultimately allowed Henry to get his ends achieved. There is the suggestion that it's possible that Cranmer might have been advocating in favour of the king's annulment for a couple of years. However, in the aftermath of the disappointment of Wolsey and Campeggio's commission, his suggestion about the universities probably couldn't have been better timed, both for Cranmer and his king. Because now Cranmer was in favour with both the king and with the family of the king's intended bride. Indeed, Cranmer would come to reside at Thomas Boleyn's house, Durham Place, and while he was there, he was working on the theoretical and theological framework to support Henry's annulment. Primary sources such as chronicles, laws, decrees and scriptures were all sifted, principally to ensure that they did in fact support the grounds for the annulment. And once this was done, they were brought together as the Collectanea Satis Copiosa, or the Sufficiently Abundant Collections. Henry received this manuscript compilation in the summer of 1530, and Cranmer was right at the heart of the team that had produced it. Cranmer is also credited with translating the collected responses from the universities that agreed with Henry, which was first published in Latin in April 1531, into English, and that English translation was published in November 1531 as the determinations of the most famous and most excellent universities of Italy and France, that it is unlawful for a man to marry his brother's wife, that the Pope hath no power to dispense therewith. As I mentioned earlier, less than a decade before this, Cranmer had shown his loyalty to both the papacy and also to orthodoxy in matters of faith through those annotations that he made in that work by John Fisher. So, is it possible perhaps that it's his work on Henry's great matter that forms a key part of the shift in Cranmer's thinking? Regardless, what is certain is that Cranmer's move towards reform and evangelism would soon be made very evident, because it can be seen in his choice to remarry in 1532, which is, of course, the year after the publication of that English translation of the determinations of the universities. This event occurred while Cranmer was on an embassy to Germany, which was part of the Holy Roman Empire at the time, and so was being ruled over by Charles V, who was, of course, the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. Now, despite the clear Roman orthodoxy of the ruler, there were still pockets of evangelism in this land that he was governing, and Nuremberg was one of them. Andreas Osiander was a Lutheran preacher whom Cranmer had befriended. Andreas had a niece by marriage called Margaret, and it was she whom Cranmer had married, potentially in the July. Clerical celibacy was still, however, very much the order of the day in England, and indeed it would remain so during the rest of Henry VIII's reign, although its revocation was something that many reformers were calling for. I believe this shows that Cranmer was not just walking the reforming path to serve the political and marital needs of his master. Rather, he is clearly rejecting orthodoxy personally and privately too. Margaret could not be publicly acknowledged by Cranmer as his wife, so she would have to stay in Nuremberg as Cranmer continued his embassy. Then, on the 22nd of August 1532, William Warham, the aged Archbishop of Canterbury, died, and King Henry VIII decided that, despite only having experience in holding minor roles in the church, Cranmer should be the one to replace Warham. Now, Cranmer would have known that this elevation would bring with it increasing scrutiny, which I imagine would have been enough to concern any ordained member of the clergy who happened to have a wife. However, I would also say that turning down the offer was probably also not really an option. And so, Cranmer returned to England in January 1533 to both ready himself a consecration into his new role and also to serve the king's desires. Margaret Cranmer, of course, still a secret wife, would therefore have to slip into England in order to be with her husband later on. So while Cranmer is busy hiding his wife and then the child, possibly even children that she bore him, he is also tasked with getting Henry legally married to Anne Boleyn. At around the time that Cranmer was returning to England, Anne had fallen pregnant. Anne and Henry would then marry privately at Whitehall Palace on the 25th of January 1533. Papal bulls to make Cranmer Archbishop of Canterbury arrived just in time for his consecration on the 30th of March 1533. Dermot McCulloch details the peculiar, borderline hypocrisy of this elevation, which took place in St Stephen's College in the Palace of Westminster. We are informed by him that, quote, Cranmer first swore an oath of loyalty to the papacy in the college chapter house. He immediately followed this with a solemn protestation declaring that his oath would not override the law of God and his loyalty to the king, or act to the hindrance of the reformation of the Christian religion, the government of the English Church, or the prerogative of the Crown, or the well-being of the same Commonwealth. Interestingly, the papal bulls that were good enough to support Cranmer's consecration were also then, oddly, of no real power in the nation that he was being consecrated in. Cranmer's next move was to try the validity of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and fairly promptly, on the 23rd of May, he announced that he was ready to give his ruling. Cranmer found that Henry's marriage to Catherine was indeed no marriage. It was in truth null and void. Now, while Mary Tudor, who had turned 17 just a few days before Cranmer's ruling, on the 18th of February 1533, would, I'm sure, not have been best pleased about Cranmer's marriages, or indeed his reforming beliefs, the fact that she was Henry's daughter with Catherine meant that this ruling, and the work that Cranmer put in place to enable it to happen, are the things that make him central to her suffering at this very early stage. Mary would consistently hold on to the belief that her parents had been married in truth, that she was thus his true, legitimate daughter and his heir. And it wasn't just Mary, because her mother also holds to this. And because mother and daughter refused to bend, they would be kept apart for the rest of Catherine's life. From this point, Mary's life became one of threats and, as she saw it, degradation. Cranmer, Mary thought, was one to blame. I must confess to a kind of morbid fascination, I suppose is the word, when I think about the events that transpired just after this ruling of 1533. So a time when Henry is already married to a pregnant Anne Boleyn and everyone is preparing for her coronation. It boggles my mind that at this stage, Cranmer warns Henry that he will be excommunicated if he does not leave Catherine of Aragon. I mean, I wonder if and or indeed how Cranmer is even able to keep a straight face while he's doing that. Whatever he may have truly felt, a few days later, on the 28th of May 1533, Cranmer would rule that Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn was indeed legitimate, legal and binding. Cranmer then presided over Anne's coronation on the 1st of June 1533. At once, Henry had his heart's desire. Anne was pregnant, all looked like it was going to be going the king's way. And while the sex of the child that Anne eventually bore Henry in September was a slight disappointment, Elizabeth's safe arrival and clear health could surely be taken as a sign that the longed-for son would, indeed must, arrive in due course. Henry's Church of England now had to begin the business of defining itself and setting terms. But complicating matters for the rest of the reign was the fact that this church would, in many ways, have to be made in Henry's image. And this was a king who revelled in fostering faction, who would happily vacillate in matters of theology to achieve that end. Ultimately, I think that the truest assessment is that Henry lived and died a Catholic, that he was born a Roman Catholic and that he died an English Catholic. Now, certainly at points, he would entertain and support the doctrinal preferences of the Reformers, while at others, it would feel like it was the turn of the Conservatives. In all eventualities, no faction could really be sure of their place. None of them could claim to even come close to a feeling of supremacy. And I think that makes sense, because of course, the supremacy was to be Henry's alone, wasn't it? What is true is that Cranmer is going to have to navigate these treacherous waters, and at times that is going to require him to balance the demands of his conscience with the understandable desire to stay alive. I think it's fair to say that the safest route for a person's earthly body during this time was to speak and act as the king desired, and that it would be even better for you if you had the rhetorical and or political skills to be able to argue in favour of the things that Henry wanted to others. As it was, Cranmer encountered some difficulties when he set out to convince people to sign the Act of Succession. And this was because both the Act and also Cranmer's authority to ask for it to be signed were called into question by some of the more orthodox bishops that he went to visit. Additionally, through this Act, Mary's new status as a bastard and also her removal from the succession to her father's throne was something that was suddenly enshrined in law. And perhaps understandably, Cranmer's part in furthering this act would not be something that Mary would be able to forget easily. There would be another shift in ecclesiastical affairs in January 1535, when Henry VIII would name Thomas Cromwell as his vice-regent or vicar-general in church matters, and this move essentially serves to place Cromwell above Cranmer. Cromwell, the lawyer, who would prove himself to be a skilled interrogator, who was able to get many or most of those he was set to work on to tie themselves up in incriminating knots. Cromwell was arguably far more adroit than Cranmer when it came to the business of confronting recalcitrant churchmen, the kind who, for example, refused to sign their names to acts. And in this, it makes Cromwell an ideal counterpart to Cranmer. While Cromwell was busy sheepdogging people into announcing either their obedience or their heresy and treason, Cranmer was in the pulpit preaching a complementary message, one that fitted with his own reforming beliefs. And in some instances, Cranmer can be seen to be pushing the envelope. So, for example, in early 1536, when Cranmer was preaching in favour of the royal supremacy, he claimed that the Pope was Antichrist. Cranmer personally and publicly supported the direction that Henry and Cromwell were taking in dissolving the smaller monasteries. At least they started off small, of course. Both the existence of purgatory and the belief that one could shorten one's time there through the founding of chantries and the paying for masses to be said for your soul were also publicly denounced by Cranmer as mere superstition. However, it would not be long before chaos, danger and tragedy came onto the horizon, because also in 1536, in the May of that year, Queen Anne Boleyn fell. And Cranmer only learnt of his queen's most dire situation on the very day of her arrest. But the following day, the 3rd of May 1536, Cranmer chose to write to his king. And in his letter, he included the following passage, quote, "And if it be true that is openly reported of the Queen's grace, if men had a right estimation of things, they should not esteem any part of your grace's honour to be touched thereby, but her honour only to be clearly disparaged. And I am in such a perplexity that my mind is clean amazed, for I never had better opinion in woman than I had in her, which maketh me to think that she should not be culpable. And again, I think your highness would not have gone so far, except she had surely been culpable. Now I think that your grace best knoweth that next unto your grace, I was most bound unto her of all creatures living." These are careful but supportive words about Anne. I think he's quite brave to write them. And towards the end of his letter, Cranmer adds the following, quote, "I trust that your grace will bear no less entire favour unto the truth of the gospel than you did before, for so much as your grace's favour to the gospel was not led by affection unto her, but by zeal unto the truth." Essentially, Cranmer is saying to Henry that even if Anne was a wrong 'un, as you are saying she is, but I'm not 100% sure, please don't undo the Reformation, Your Majesty. Cranmer heard Anne's confession on the 16th of May. He declared her marriage to the king null and void on the 17th, and she was executed on the 19th. On that fateful day, Cranmer reportedly said that Anne would become, quote, "a queen in heaven," and then he was witnessed bursting into tears. Now, if Mary Tudor ever learned of the grief that Cranmer had displayed over Anne, this woman, who she had refused to recognise as her father's wife and queen, and who had become another focus of blame for the suffering that she had experienced, then I am sure that this would only have gone further to fuel her animosity for the man. To make matters worse, Anne's execution did nothing to alleviate Mary's pain, and I do think that this would have genuinely surprised her. Perhaps it's something that contributes to what she does on the 22nd of June 1536, because on that date, Mary gives in. She acknowledges herself to be illegitimate, that her parents had never been truly married, and of course that her father was the supreme head of the church in England. In doing so, Mary was forced to act against her conscience. She feared that possibly she had endangered her immortal soul. But the payoff was that she was finally rehabilitated in her father's affections. Also, she and her supporters could breathe a sigh of relief because they were no longer under the threat of being labelled as traitors and being punished as such. I think that Mary's capitulation came just in time for her and her followers, because there probably would have been a greater roughness in their treatment had there still been any resistance by the October of 1536, the time when the Pilgrimage of Grace was trying to question Henry's right to claim authority of the Church in England. Also at this time, some of these pilgrims/rebels were threatening to kill Cranmer for the part that he was playing in, as they saw it, corrupting their king and destroying their church. Now, of course, Cranmer wasn't the only one under threat of assassination, because the rebels' sights were also set on, among others, Thomas Cromwell and Richard Rich. Now, if the pilgrims of the Pilgrimage of Grace had zeroed in on Cranmer as someone who was to blame for the changes to the church that they grew up with and in many cases loved, as Mary Tudor did, is it surprising that he was also the focus for her animosity too? Because, let's be honest, Cranmer certainly oversaw a lot of destruction in Mary's life, and that came in both a personal and a faith context. The birth of Edward in 1537 did, however, alleviate things a little for Mary. Now there was an unquestionably legitimate son in the royal nursery, and so Mary's long-held principles regarding her own legitimacy and indeed her right to be in the succession didn't need to be pressed quite so hard. Now, that isn't to say that all was going to be peaceful for Mary during the remainder of her father's reign. Certainly not. Because not only was there going to be continued religious wrangling, there was also going to be a hefty dose of domestic trauma. And in all cases, Cranmer was going to be visible for much of it, because he was doing his best to act according to his conscience or even preference, while also avoiding the flames or the axe. Prince Edward's birth led to the death of his mother, Jane Seymour, and as such, it created a vacuum in the royal household. It would be nearly 3 years before Henry would marry again. During this period, England played host to a variety of evangelical leaders from Europe. They came in the hopes of being able to reach both a theological consensus and also to obtain some diplomatic alliances. Ultimately, the talks came to nothing in any of these directions. Then, in 1539, the Church of England turned on a sixpence, figuratively, and began to veer towards increasing orthodoxy and conservatism, which is shown in the passing of the Act of 6 Articles. Now, this act enshrines a collection of beliefs, including that the bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ during the communion, i.e., the doctrine of transubstantiation. Also, that receiving both the bread and the wine was not absolutely needed for all people during communion, that vows of chastity were binding, that private masses and auricular confession had worth, and that priests were obligated to remain celibate. At this point, Cranmer's wife and daughter had to leave England for Germany. The Orthodox faction at court felt, not without reason, that they had finally gained the upper hand. Soon, however, things looked like they might reverse when the reforming faction at court, in this case spearheaded by Thomas Cromwell, were able to lead the charge towards Henry getting a new wife. Cranmer was urging caution, but Cromwell decided to forge on. As for Henry, he was at first charmed by the lady's portrait and very keen for the match. But as it was, he proved to be an unwilling bridegroom to Anne of Cleves on the 6th of January 1540, and the marriage was a brief and embarrassing disaster. Thomas Cromwell was arrested on the 10th of June 1540, and as he had in the case of Anne Boleyn, Cranmer wrote to Henry in favour of the prisoner, in favour of this man who had been Vicar General and Vice-Regent of the church that Cranmer was an Archbishop in. Nevertheless, Cranmer would still vote in favour of the Act of Attainder that would ultimately lead to Cromwell's execution on the 28th of July 1540. If he was going to survive, Cranmer would have to some degree at least, find a way to fill and take up the space that was left behind by Cromwell. It would not be long before Cranmer was voluntold for the unenviable task of informing Henry that his fifth wife, Catherine Howard, was someone with a past. It was a past that, in the thinking of the day, made her unsuitable to be Henry's wife and queen. Henry had thought of Catherine as his rose without thorns, but as the confessions began to roll in, this king felt cheated and enraged. On the 2nd of November 1541, Cranmer had been the one to give Henry a letter which detailed certain allegations that had been made against Catherine Howard. Then it would be Cranmer who obtained her written confession, which in turn would support another Act of Attainder. This was the one that saw Catherine Howard executed on the 13th of February 1542. Mary Tudor would turn 26 years old just 5 days after this execution. And I do have to wonder, what must she have thought? To be the now illegitimate daughter of a man who had lost one wife in childbed, abandoned 2 others, one of them her own mother, and then executed 2 more. It's my belief that Mary was, for some reason, pathologically incapable of blaming her father for any of the pain or shame that he undoubtedly caused her. So, how helpful must it have been, psychologically, if nothing else, that Thomas Cranmer was on hand, present and visible for all of this stuff? I mean, it certainly placed him perfectly to act as Mary's scapegoat for the, I'd say, justifiable rage that she might have directed towards her father. But Mary wasn't alone, though, because Cranmer had other enemies, and they had started collecting evidence of his alleged heresy that they planned to present to Henry in the early months of 1543. The king took no action for a number of months, but eventually, at some point in the autumn, Henry chose to meet with his Archbishop of Canterbury. At this time, he detailed all of the charges that had been levelled against Cranmer. He then denounced him as the, quote, greatest heretic in Kent, and also made a thinly veiled reference, almost a joke, about Cranmer's marriage. I can only imagine that Cranmer would have both seen and heard his own pulse as this was going on. But it seems that Henry was actually in a sportive mood, and rather than having Cranmer clapped in irons and prepared for burning, instead he told him to investigate the claims himself, having first hand-picked his own commission. As this controversy rumbled on, Henry gave Cranmer's enemy leave to accuse him of heresy, but he also chose to summon Cranmer to him the night before he was set to be confronted in order to hand him his own ring, so that Cranmer could show his accusers that he had Henry's favour and thus secure their public humiliation. The Conservative faction, however, wouldn't learn from this, and they would find themselves to be similarly embarrassed a few years later in 1546. At this time, they had sought to bring down Henry's reform-minded sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, a woman who Henry had married on the 12th of July 1543. Henry allowed a warrant for her arrest on a charge of heresy to be signed and issued, but Catherine learnt of it. She routed her accusers by going to Henry and finding a way to appease him, and considering she found out about the arrest and had the chance to meet with him, I'd say that this was likely what Henry was really after from her in the first place. But despite her capitulation, Henry doesn't cancel the warrant. Instead, he just makes sure he's with his wife when the guards turn up and try to arrest her. This enables the king to rebuke his guards, which in turn acts as a public show that once again puts the Conservative faction back in their box, so to speak. It is unclear just what Cranmer and Catherine Parr thought of one another, although Demma McCulloch does write that quote. It is tempting to suggest that it was during the summer of 1544, with Henry absent on French campaigning and Catherine as regent in daily contact with Cranmer, that the Queen developed her strong commitment to evangelical piety. What do you think? Could Cranmer have been the one to radicalise Catherine while she was busy acting as Henry's regent? I mean, certainly Cranmer was continuing his reforming moves. I mean, he was responsible for the first officially authorised service in English in 1544. Then the next year, in May 1545, he oversaw the publication of an authorised and official English primer that he had been involved in creating. This famous portrait of Cranmer was also being produced and completed at around this time. The final years of Henry's reign were chaotic, confusing, and dangerous. But throughout them, Thomas Cranmer avoided the real jeopardy, and he was with Henry to offer spiritual succour as the king died on the 28th of January 1547. The next reign of Henry's son Edward would be characterised by an overt shift towards the Reformed faith. So, for example, Cranmer's wife was soon back in England, and he was also not going to be keeping her a secret for much longer. Mary Tudor, for her part, began to voice her concerns about the changes in matters of faith pretty quickly. It was her belief that none of these changes should be being made to her father's religious settlement until Edward was old enough to rule in his own right. I mean, when it came to her father's settlement, Mary certainly wasn't overjoyed at England's separation from Rome. She wasn't keen on her father's claim to be the true head of the church in England. I mean, she was attached to the traditions and rites of the Roman Catholic faith. However, her father's 1536 settlement does seem to have been something that Mary could live with. I mean, potentially live with in quiet disapproval, but live with nonetheless. And I do think that that is in part because this settlement allowed Mary to worship privately as she wished. It let her partake in certain works, like the giving of alms. To keep the peace, to offer compromise, Mary abjured from making pilgrimages and from visiting shrines. However, at the very start of Edward's reign, she was already being given cause for concern. For example, take the liturgy of the Eucharist. At the start of this reign, it's being altered and experimented with, and the changes were being made compulsory. Now, this would have meant that Mary's private faith practice would potentially be endangered. Ultimately, though, Mary was encouraged, I think we can read threatened, into holding her peace for a couple of years. But then came 1549. A year that saw the publication of the Book of Common Prayer, which would in turn become the compulsory way of worship in the same year. Additionally, in 1549 came the passing of the Act of Uniformity. Clerical marriage was also sanctioned in this year, and Cranmer was at the vanguard of these innovations. From this point until the end of her little brother's reign, Mary was once again embroiled in a high conflict family dynamic with conscience at its core. And I think it's easy to see how Mary could once again view Cranmer as the source of her suffering. Angry letters are being shuttled between these actually quite loving and affectionate siblings. Because of this, there are rows when they meet in person. There are tears and threats. Mary was 33 years old in 1549, and even though her brother was a king, it must have been increasingly galling for her to receive the remonstrations of this preteen whom she had once dandled on her knee when he was a baby. Things got so bad that in 1550, Mary was sorely tempted to try and flee from England, and she's only stopped when her advisers convince her that if she were to leave, she would lose her place in the succession to the throne. As it was, of course, staying was all for nothing because Mary was going to have to fight. Because she had been excluded in the device for the succession that Edward had left behind at his death on the 6th of July 1553. In her place, her Protestant kinswoman, Lady Jane Grey, had been elevated. Thomas Cranmer supported Jane's rule in both word and deed, although he would soon enough be asserting that he had tried to dissuade Edward VI from his plan to name Jane as his heir. Thomas Cranmer was left at liberty as Jane's queenship fell apart and she and her supporters were imprisoned. Cranmer was thus free and available to lead Edward VI's funeral service in Westminster Abbey on the 8th of August 1553. And he did this according to the rites that had been set down in his and Edward's Book of Common Prayer. I must say, I do have to wonder why Cranmer didn't take this, frankly, enormous window of opportunity as a moment to escape to the continent. I mean, he must have known that a reckoning would be coming his way. I think a big part of why Cranmer ends up bearing the brunt of Mary's vengeance is that he's the one that's still around. I mean, of all the people that could have been viewed as being central to her suffering during those most formative years of her life, who else is left? Anne Boleyn is long dead. Her father has also died, but not Cranmer. At least, not for now. On September the 5th, 1553, Cranmer was questioned about his part in trying to make Jane Grey queen. On the same day as his questioning, Cranmer's complaints about the speed with which England was being returned to papal control was printed and had started doing the rounds. Cranmer was brought before the Star Chamber on the 14th of September for his alleged sedition, and from there he was promptly sent to the Tower of London. On the 13th of November he was brought to the Guildhall with Jane Grey, her husband Guildford Dudley, and Guildford's brothers Henry and Ambrose, where they were all to answer a charge of treason. The accused were all found guilty and were sentenced to die. But Cranmer would be spared when, in February 1554, following the failure of the Wyatt Rebellion, it was Jane and Guildford who were executed, and not him. The next month, Cranmer was taken to Oxford to be tried for heresy, though. At first, there was a disputation where Cranmer made a good showing by all accounts, before being returned to his imprisonment. In 1555, Cranmer was summoned to Rome to stand trial. In the end, his trial was actually held in Oxford, and it began on the 12th of September, although it was performed with papal authority, and so the final verdict for Cranmer would, however, have to come from Rome. Disturbingly, Cranmer was made to witness the burning of his friends and fellow reformers, Nicholas Ridley and Hugh Latimer, on the 16th of October 1555. These men had also been imprisoned with Cranmer. Now, Cranmer would have to face what came next in spiritual solitude. Soon, Cranmer began to attend Mass and other services. By the 28th of January 1556, Cranmer seemingly was sufficiently broken, having seen his friends burnt and being surrounded by cajoling and threatening Roman Catholics, that he finally signed a document that went some of the way towards him admitting that he did in fact recognise the authority of the Pope. 3 more submissions were sought and obtained from Cranmer during February, but for his enemies these still did not go far enough. And so, on the 24th of February, the Mayor of Oxford was ordered to prepare for Cranmer's burning. It was going to take place on the 7th of March. But then, 2 days after this order had been issued, so on the 26th of February 1556, it seems that the strain became too much, because Cranmer would buckle, and he would provide a full recantation of his former faith. Spiritually, he had been totally routed, and Queen Mary had been vindicated. Her father's abandonment of her mother, the shame and torment that Mary herself had lived through after being named illegitimate, was being denounced by the very person who had given those things theological foundations. Now, the tradition of canon law held that the heretic who recanted shouldn't burn, but should instead be granted a reprieve, allowed to go free, unless, of course, they relapsed in their heresy. But at this point, Cranmer had not relapsed. But nevertheless, it was decided that he was not to be spared. On the 18th of March, Cranmer was encouraged to make another statement denying the principles of his former faith, which he did. He had done as he was asked, but it was determined that Thomas Cranmer should be burnt on the 21st of March 1556. But that wasn't to be all, because before he endured the agony of the flames, he was also expected to take to a pulpit and publicly recant his former faith during a service at the University Church in Oxford. He was thus to be shamed and abased before finally being committed to the flames. As it was, Cranmer took to the pulpit and spectacularly, and for the state at least embarrassingly, recanted his recantations. He denounced the Pope and all of his previously signed statements. Unsurprisingly, he was fairly swiftly pulled down from that pulpit and taken out to the pyre. But here too, he manages to control the narrative, because as he's being dragged out of the church, he starts to proclaim that he is going to ensure that his unworthy right hand, the one that had so offended by signing those statements of recantation, would be the part of him that he would ensure would be punished first. It is an action that was eventually immortalised in this image that comes from Fox's Acts and Monuments, which is perhaps better known as Fox's Book of Martyrs. Queen Mary may have sort of won the battle with Cranmer, but I think it was a hollow victory. Because I think that ultimately the war of words would be won by Cranmer, and especially by those that preserved and indeed weaponised his legacy for the future. And most devastatingly, of course, that future would not be one that Mary could rule over, because Queen Mary I would die on the 17th of November 1558. During the next reign, that of Mary's half-sister Elizabeth, it would come to be ordered that the 1570 edition of this text, Fox's Book of Martyrs, should be placed beside the Bible in English in every cathedral church in the land. I would argue that through this, the Marian persecutions and the suffering they caused became central to the identity of the Church of England under Elizabeth's governance, and also that the text and images contained within Fox's book became foundational for shaping Queen Mary I's later reputation as Bloody Mary. Perhaps then we might argue that even in death, Mary Tudor is unable to escape the effects of Thomas Cranmer, that he is still causing her to be shamed and degraded. If she were able to go back and change things, particularly in relation to Cranmer's end, I do wonder if she would. But what do you think about whether Mary would choose to spare Cranmer if she knew how things were set to play out? Or perhaps about why it was Cranmer that seems to have become who Mary fixated on as a target for her rage? Or indeed, what do you think about anything else that we've looked at today? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comments section underneath this video, or you can find me elsewhere on other social media. I'll be sure to leave links to the places you can find me on the internet in my description box, so do come and follow me over on some or all of them so that we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful, and if you did, why not share it with some friends? Please also let me know you liked it by hitting the thumbs up, and please subscribe to the channel. And I do say this every week, but just check that you are subscribed if you think you are and want to be, because YouTube does keep unsubscribing people and I don't know why. While you're there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, please also hit the bell icon that sits beside the subscribe button so that YouTube will tell you when I've next uploaded. I hope you're going to have a great day, whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.